views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Tonight, our guest is Congressman Ritchie Torres, and we're thrilled that he's able to join us. We're recording this on Thursday. It ends up getting played on Monday, so you get the timing because with virtual technology, we can move very quickly. And so we'll say good evening to Congressman Ritchie Torres.
It's an honor to be here as always, Gary.
Thank you very much. You mentioned as you sat down that today was a day of voting and you're involved. Since we can do this virtually and we don't have to wait for you to come up a week later in the studio, what have you been working on? What are you voting on today? What are the things that Ritchie Torres is doing today in Washington?
Well, there have been a series of committee hearings. So one on housing affordability in the context of the American Jobs Plan. We had a hearing on financial institutions. There's a real need to modernize financial regulation as we have tech companies entering the financial sector. And then we're passing the Payment Protection Act, which would address gender inequity in the workforce.
Can I make a general assumption that because, especially in the House, Democrats, have their clear majority, that you're pretty confident once these things are negotiated, that the things that you would like to see get passed? Or is there real still pushback and even though you have the votes, there's still, for want of a better term, a fight to get things done?
The honest answer is that it's unclear, right? The question is, what process are we going to rely on? Are we going to go through reconciliation, which is exempt from the filibuster? Or are we going to go through the normal legislative process, which is subject to the 60 vote threshold that the filibuster imposes in the Senate? I am suspicious of the normal legislative process because Republicans have been intransigent in their opposition to everything we propose. But the filibuster reconciliation has its challenges. We can only afford to lose 2 votes in the House. It's a razor thin margin. And then we can afford to lose no votes in the Senate. We're effectively living under the tyranny of Joe Manchin. One US senator is empowered to derail the priorities of a Democratic president and a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate. And that's the challenge that we're grappling with.
Before I have a lot of issues I want to get to, but before we get in specific to those, you're a freshman. The last time we spoke to you was, I think, right after January 6th. So we were a little distracted by that, obviously. What's it been like for you? And are there things that you say to yourself, gee, I never expected this? Or is it pretty much going as you expected? Just give us some firsthand impression as a freshman who has an incredible opportunity for his community. What's it been like?
It's been the greatest satisfaction of my life. I'm in an office that once belonged to John F. Kennedy when he was a member of the House of Representatives. I'm part of the same legislative chamber that was once home to Abraham Lincoln. And when you step on the floor of the House, you feel the weight of history of your shoulders. You feel like you're part of something much greater than yourself. And I feel like when you're a member of Congress, when you're a member of the world's most powerful legislature, you're in a position to do an enormous amount of good for an enormous number of people. Do you
often or sometimes say to yourself, look where I was in the Bronx growing up in public housing and look where I am now? Or is that something you've been through that, you get it? Or is that something you feel strongly about even on a daily basis?
I always feel a sense of awe. For me, it's surreal and shocking. And, my life has been a journey from public housing in the Bronx to the House of Representatives in Washington, D.C. And I'm forward to the call, as you know. Even when I leave Washington, D.C. for the Bronx never leaves me.
Okay, well, the colloquial saying is you can take the boy out of the Bronx, but you can't take the Bronx out of the boy. That seems to apply. All right, let's roll up our sleeves. When you were in the city council and frankly, one of the really driving political agendas for your life and your career has been public housing and improving public housing. I recall, I believe the last time we talked directly about this, we talked about a need for $16 billion to repair public housing. The stimulus bill is providing $40 billion. You are saying, wait a minute, I want $70 billion. Let's talk about those numbers and what are the needs you think that extra funding will address.
So first, I fully support the American Jobs Plan, which is the president's vision for infrastructure. The president has taken an expansive vision of infrastructure. He recognizes that infrastructure is about more than roads and bridges, but it's about the quality of the air we breathe and the water we drink. It's about safe, decent, affordable housing. It's about access to the internet, especially during COVID-19. So we have to recognize that infrastructure is much broader than we've come to realize historically. At the heart of that is public housing. In New York City, public housing has been so savagely defunded that it has a capital need of $40 billion and counting. And the people who have paid the price are the tenants in public housing. Right? You have senior citizens who, during the cold of winter, are freezing in their homes with the boilers breaking down. You have disabled residents who are stranded in top floor apartments in their own homes with the elevators breaking down. You have asthmatics who are struggling to breathe in the face of molded and leaking conditions. You have children who have been poisoned by lead, whose life has never been the same because the consequences of lead poisoning last a lifetime. These are the consequences of federal disinvestment from public housing. It's a humanitarian crisis. And we know that in order to address the humanitarian crisis in public housing, we need $40 billion alone for New York City and $70 billion for public housing nationwide. And so we've called upon the Biden administration to increase the dollar amount that would go to public housing within the American Jobs Plan.
Are you optimistic about that happening, or is it like everything else? You just got to keep pushing.
Look, everything in Washington, D.C. is an uphill battle, but I'm more optimistic than we've ever been because we are in the midst of an FDR moment. We have a historic opportunity to govern as boldly in the 21st century as FDR did in the 20th century. And there is real support for greater investment in NYCHA, not only from myself, but from multiple members of the New York City congressional delegation, from Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, from Chair Maxine Waters, who heads financial services, which has jurisdiction over public housing. So there's deep support for greater reinvestment in public housing.
Let's talk about another issue. You participated in the National Resources Committee hearing on Puerto Rican statehood. Do you believe in self-determination for Puerto Ricans? And what was the outcome of that hearing? And is there something to report about where this is headed?
I strongly support self-determination, but it has the meaning of self-determination varies depending on the people to whom you speak. For me, self-determination means following the will of the people. And in November of 2020, a majority of the Puerto Rican electorate voted for statehood. And my view is that when the people have spoken, we in Congress have an obligation to legislate what the people voted for. So what matters is not the opinion of the United States Congress. What matters is the opinion of the people as expressed through a democratic process. There was a plebiscite in November of 2020, and we ought to respect the results of the plebiscite.
At the same time, you put out materials calling for the Recovery Act after Hurricane Maria to be adequately supported, which, at least in your judgment, still has not been. Where is that at? And I know many Bronx Puerto Ricans are going to say, wait a minute, we're still waiting.
The president is committed to allocating more resources to Puerto Rico, but instead of treating the symptom, we have to address the underlying disease. Right? The absence of statehood has left Puerto Rico wide open to colonization at the hands of the Financial Control Board. Right? If Puerto Rico were a state, it would have 2 US senators. It would have 5 members of Congress. It would receive billions of dollars in new funding from programs like Medicare and Medicaid. It would have more resources and more representation. So statehood is good economics for Puerto Rico. And that should be the future of the island.
The stimulus bill added a child tax credit in it. You and others hailed poverty provisions in the bill as a literal end to child poverty in this country. That is a bold contention. Why don't you unwrap for us how that money would be applied, and then how it would really have what you believe to be a significant impact on child poverty in this country?
So beginning in May, families will begin to benefit from the child tax credit. Families in need will receive up to $360 per month per child, up to $360 a month. And unlike most tax credits, which are structured annually, these will come in the form of monthly payments because most households have monthly expenses. It's much more convenient and much more stimulative of the economy to structure it as monthly payments. You know, it's often said that the South Bronx is the poorest congressional district in America. There is no policy that will do more to lift the South Bronx out of poverty than the expansion of the child tax credit. Before the expansion, the structure of the child tax credit was so regressive that it left behind a third of American children, the poorest children in our country, 27 million American children. And no community was more left behind than the South Bronx, where 2/3 of children were excluded from the full benefit of the child tax credit. The expansion under the American Rescue Plan will cut child poverty in half.
Because people will have that money, and then presumably for food, for school supplies, or any of the, even to participate in a little league activity that's going to cost a little money, which is so important to a child, or even get them a musical instrument, I'd like to think. Right? I mean, that's what we're talking about.
The best way to solve poverty is to put money in the pockets of people who need it. And in America, childhood poverty is expensive.
You are advocating for this child tax credit to be a permanent situation. Where does that stand? I mean, it's so easy to say, well, here's another, high spending Democrat.
Well, I see it as an investment in our children rather than an expenditure. And it's a program that commands bipartisan support. But as you correctly noted, I'm partnering with the Appropriations Chair, Rosa DeLauro, and Congressman Susan Delbene as a lead sponsor of the American Family Act, which would permanently expand the child tax credit, right? It would be cruel to lift millions of children out of poverty and then plunge them back into the abyss. So I'm strongly advocating for a permanent expansion in the next reconciliation bill. And President Biden has come out in favor of a permanent expansion because it is the centerpiece of the Democratic Party's agenda. I mean, what can be more important than ending child poverty?
Let's talk about the current day and vaccines. Vaccine rates in low-income communities are disturbing, to say the least. Vaccines in low-income communities, only 26% of Bronx residents have had one shot, compared to 37% of those in Manhattan. What are the issues, and how do we turn that around so there's equitability?
Well, there's a misconception that communities of color are uniquely resistant to vaccination. We know from a Kaiser Family Foundation poll that Americans from every ethnic and racial background are largely willing to be vaccinated. And in fact, the group that has the most vaccine hesitancy are Republican white evangelicals. So the racial disparities that we've seen in vaccination rates is more a product of vaccine access than vaccine hesitancy. And I've said publicly that one of the greatest barriers to access is the digital divide. If you have no access to the internet, or no computer literacy, or no electronic device at home, then you have no means of participating in an online vaccine appointment system. And it's first come, first serve. And those who have access to the internet are often the first to come and the first to be served. And our senior citizens, who tend to be the least digitally savvy, are often left behind. So we have a system that discriminates against those who are at the wrong end of the digital divide.
This becomes part of an infrastructure question as far as broadband access. I mean, the city, you were in the city council, the city of New York, certainly for our locales, has made an attempt. It's not been a totally effective attempt at broadband access. How do you see that? Is that simply an infrastructure funding concept?
It may be the most important infrastructure investment we could make. When we made the transition from in-person instruction to remote learning, it became painfully clear that not every child had access to the internet. And not every child with internet access had an electronic device at home. And so we saw during COVID-19, the digital divide deprive our students of their fundamental right to an education. And I worry that the loss of learning during COVID-19 is going to have lasting consequences that will endure long after the pandemic is gone. And communities of color in places like the South Bronx are the hardest hit. So I see the need to close the digital divide as a moral imperative. To be disconnected from the internet is to be disconnected from your fundamental right to an education in a time of remote learning.
Let's talk about bringing home the bacon, so to speak. You very recently got new funding for 8 Bronx health centers for COVID vaccines and for COVID care. We're going to put it up on the screen. Urban Health Plan got the biggest grant, Bronx Community Health Network, Bronx Health Integrated Services, the Morris Heights Health Center, Union Community Health Center, Montefiore Medical Center, La Casa de Salud, and the Vocational Instruction Project of Community Services. Talk about getting that money, bringing home that bacon as a freshman congressman during this time of incredible need must have been pretty gratifying.
Our community health centers have a special place in my heart. Community health centers are not only in the Bronx, these institutions are of the Bronx. And these institutions are on the front lines of ensuring that no one is left behind when it comes to vaccination. Part of the problem with the approach that the city has taken is, we set up a vaccination site at a place like Yankee Stadium, and then we expect poor people of color to show up. But if you're a homebound senior citizen, you're in no physical position to go to Yankee Stadium. Or if you are,
if I can interrupt, much less to make the appointment, because you'll need, we go back to the last question, you'll need broadband and you'll need the digital.
There are layers and layers of barriers. And if you're a single mother working long hours, you're in no position, you lack the time to go to Yankee Stadium. And then many of these sites had no prioritization for local residents. I know people from Westchester County who were heavily vaccinated in Bronx-based vaccination sites. So that was a critical error that the city and the state and the federal government made early on. The opposite is true with our community health centers. Our community health centers are serving people here in the Bronx, right? These are institutions that have deep roots in the Bronx, that have deep relationships with the lowest income communities of color. And our vaccination campaign should run through our community health centers. That's how you ensure that everyone, the most vulnerable among us, have access to the vaccine.
And the amounts of money, I mean, we could throw them up on the screen again, but you're really talking millions of dollars. And
69 million.
69 million. It certainly, is well needed and well placed as far as I can see. Let's talk about violence. Another young black man was killed by police in Minnesota, remarkably. This time a stated case of a mistake. What are your thoughts about this particular case and policing in general? Is this do we need a national police reform bill of some sort, or are we ready to say municipalities, let's all take a look at this and let's get a better understanding of how policing works? But there's no question this is monumentally disturbing for any right-thinking person.
Well, we need police reforms at every level of government. The House, but not the Senate, passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would establish a police misconduct national registry. So it would prevent the most abusive officers from lurching from one police department to the next across jurisdictions. You know, we have a vested interest in knowing who the worst police officers are and prevent them from ever serving in any police force in the United States. The most important policy within the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act is the end of qualified immunity. I mean, qualified immunity has essentially become a license to brutalize Black and brown lives with impunity. Under qualified immunity, even if you show that an officer engaged in excessive force and violated your civil rights, the officer can nevertheless be granted immunity. Right? The theory of qualified immunity is that it protects officers from frivolous litigation, but the reality is that it protects officers from even the barest amount of accountability. And my argument is that where there is no accountability, there will never be an end to police brutality. If officers are never punished or prosecuted for misconduct, then those officers have no incentive to exercise restraint and have no incentive to practice de-escalation. And that's the dynamic that we see playing out in American policing.
For somebody who was in the city council and knows what the dialogue is like in the city council, do you see this as a federal undertaking, or should it be? I mean, of course, both the council and the state legislature are having these same dialogues. How could this or should this be legislated from the federal government?
There's a role for every level of government, because ultimately police departments are run by local governments. But there's a role for the federal government to play in abolishing qualified immunity in federal courts. That's only something that the United States Congress can do. I think what we should strive for is transparent and accountable policing. Transparent, accountable, constitutional policing.
A lot of people have seen this video. We're going to show this video of the DigiDog, which is now this new. And as incredible as the vaccines are, this is just an incredible sight to see a robot dog handling some of the initial contact with potential criminals or situations. Let's put it that way. How do you look at that? Is this the kind of thing where we can go to demilitarize our police force and get them to back off and use the technology where we can? Do you like it?
Look, it serves as a reminder that the NYPD is essentially a paramilitary force. It is shrouded in secrecy, and there's no transparency around the mass surveillance state that the NYPD has administered. So there needs to be more accountability and transparency. The NYPD should be providing briefings to the city council about the kind of surveillance technology that it has put to use, because fundamental civil liberties, the right to privacy, is at stake. And the NYPD has been operating in secrecy, and elected officials are largely out of the loop. I mean, that robot came as a shock to me. I did not even realize something like that existed. And the NYPD needs to be more accountable to those of us in elected office.
This is a very busy, let's put it that way, time for Bronx politics, and we have a big primary coming up. Essentially entire city council is going to be overhauled. Certainly the Bronx delegation is going to look very different than it was when even just a little while back when you were a council member. You congratulated Oswald Felice as your immediate successor. Do you intend to support him all the way through the primary? There are other well-qualified candidates. What are your thoughts on that race in particular as we get toward the primary?
Yes, I don't know the contours of the primary, but my sense is Oswald is going to be a phenomenal council member. I have found him to be a profoundly decent person. He has a good mind and a good heart. That's the combination that you hope for in an elected official. So I look forward to working with him. My highest priority is to enable him to succeed as a member of the city council, because the district he represents is special to me. He's about to become the youngest member of the city council. When I first assumed office back in 2014, I was the youngest member of the city council. And the same was true of my predecessor. So there's a sense in which District 15 is the baby seat in the New York City Council. And I have a vested interest in seeing him succeed. And I have no doubt that he has the ability to be an effective representative for the Central Bronx.
Have you looked at the borough president's race, and do you have a favorite candidate there? Is that something you're going to get involved in?
Fully supportive of Councilmember Gibson. She's one of there's no colleague in the Bronx with whom I have a closer working relationship. She means the world to me as a public servant. There's just no one who has a more encyclopedic knowledge of her district. She has her feet firmly planted in the ground. She's visible, she's active. She would make an exceptional borough president, and I'm 100% behind Vanessa.
You were one of the first to, when Andrew Yang announced his candidacy for mayor, you were one of the first to come out. You are the first. All right. So let's alter my introduction to this question.
His launch.
What do you like about Andrew Yang? There are many very qualified candidates. I mean, people know who they are. We did our own forum here, and there are other forums coming up. Why, number one, did you step out so early rather than waiting to see the field? And what was it about Mr. Yang that made you say, I'd like to see him be the mayor?
Yeah, it's never been in my nature to be cautious.
I'm aware of that. We've been doing this a little while.
If I believe in you, I'm going to support you early and energetically. And I believe in Andrew. Albert Einstein once said, if you do the same thing over and over again and expect a different results, that's the definition of insanity. And what is most compelling about Andrew is that he's independent of a political establishment that has largely failed the city of New York in its moment of greatest crisis. He is not a political insider. He represents an infusion of new energy and new ideas. And he's a profoundly decent person. He projects nothing but positivity. And we need someone who's going to be a cheerleader for the city. We need someone who's going to represent the can-do comeback spirit of New York City in a moment of crisis. So I feel like he's exactly the kind of person that we need in the midst of our recovery.
Does his lack of legislative experience concern you, and maneuvering in the city of New York, and you've had to do it as a young man as well? Does that concern you?
So that criticism, in my opinion, ignores.
We got about 30 seconds, so I'll give you that.
That ignores the nature of the role of mayor. The mayor is not micromanaging the day-to-day operations of the city. The mayor is articulating a vision, is inspiring the people. But the mayor hires talented people who know the mechanics of city government, and then you empower those people to execute the day-to-day operations of the city. Andrew is more than capable of attracting the best and the brightest to serve in city government and to get New York to believe in itself again.
Congressman, I know you got to go. We took you out of your very busy day. We appreciate your time this evening, and good luck. And we certainly will stay in touch with you about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much. Ritchie Torres from the 15th Congressional District.
Take care, Gary.
Okay, we thank the Congressman for joining us. I know he's very busy. We appreciate his time. Also, thanks to our producers, Rebecca Hemick and Stephen Powell. Our intern is Eitan Sanger. And guess what? We'll see you next week for more.